He paid $50,000 to make sure the baby never existed. So why is she standing in front of him 17 years later, silent, staring and holding a drawing of him burying something in the ground? He paid $50,000 to erase a child, and 17 years later that child stood staring at him from across a gravel road in a town too small to forget. Henry Whitmore had been a name once whispered on Wall Street, but now in Wilburn, Kentucky, he was just the quiet man fixing church gutters and planting roses no one asked for. No one knew who he really was, except Clara, the woman he left behind with a swollen belly and no explanation, and Ellie the daughter who never spoke a word, but always knew more than she let on. The town didn't ask questions until a letter surfaced. Old ink yellow paper, the kind of thing that burns slow, the kind of truth that doesn't stay buried. They said he came back to make peace, but peace doesn't grow where silence rots. And when the whispers turned to questions, and the questions turned to names, Henry had to choose disappear again, or finally stay and watch the seeds he once abandoned bloom in a soil he never dared to touch. They didn't know who he was when he first arrived, just that he came in quiet late September with a beat-up truck and a face too still for a man with that many scars. Folks in Wilburn, Kentucky weren't the kind to pry on the first day, but they noticed things. They noticed how he didn't say where he was from, how he paused too long when asked about family, how he looked at the town's lone grocery store like it was some kind of relic. He introduced himself only as Mr. Witt, a name that rolled off his tongue like it didn't quite belong to him, and no one pressed further. They were used to drifters, used to folks looking to disappear for a while. What they weren't used to was someone who seemed like he was trying to remember how to be human. He rented the old cabin near the edge of the cemetery, the one no one wanted since the flood took half the porch off 3 springs ago. Paid 6 months in cash, no questions. Spent the first week mending the porch with his own hands, no help, no complaints. He didn't whistle, he didn't hum, he just worked like the silence was all he had left. Kids on bikes watched from a distance. Their mothers warned them to stay clear. Give him space, darlin'. He's got that look. And he did. That look. Not mean, not angry, just absent. Like whatever light used to live behind his eyes had long since gone out and he hadn't noticed. At the diner, he sat in the corner booth and read an old paperback until the coffee went cold. At church, he never stepped inside, but he trimmed the hedges around it without being asked. By the 3rd week, people stopped whispering. They started waving. "Mornin', Mr. Witt," they'd say, and he'd nod like he was grateful they didn't call him anything else. The name Henry hadn't touched his ears in nearly a decade, and it wouldn't hear not if he could help it. But even in a town as small and slow as Wilburn, ghosts had a way of moving faster than forgiveness. And while the locals saw a quiet man trying to stay out of the way, one woman saw something else. Clara. She watched from the window of her late mother's house on Hickory Road, eyes narrowed like memory was a wound she never let close. When she saw him step into that church garden with a bag of fertilizer and a borrowed rake, her hands trembled, not out of fear, but fury. He didn't look back at her. He hadn't seen her yet. But she knew who he was before he ever said a word. The lines in his face had deepened. Yes. His hair was white now, and he walked with a softness that only came after loss. But you don't forget the man who paid to erase your child. And Wilburn, Kentucky might not have recognized the name Henry Whitmore, but Clara did. The air around her shifted. The past she had buried for 17 years had just walked back into town and rented the house beside her father's grave. The house he chose was the kind most people drove past without seeing a small, weather-worn cabin tucked behind a thicket of dogwoods near the edge of the old cemetery. It leaned slightly to the left as if tired of standing, and the porch had half collapsed in a storm no one remembered clearly anymore. The roof bore a missing shingle patchwork, and ivy had crept up the side like it was trying to reclaim the wood back into the earth. But when Mr. Witt saw it, he didn't flinch. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, staring at it like it was something he'd once dreamed about, a place forgotten by time, and therefore safe for a man like him. He paid in cash 6 months up front to a landlord who looked at the bills and then at him shrugged and said, "Don't expect heat in the winter." He didn't. Henry Whitmore, though no one called him that. Now moved in with only a duffel bag, a battered toolbox, and a book of psalms too creased to be new. He kept to himself, didn't ask for anything, didn't offer much either. Each morning he rose early before the church bell rang and began to work. Not just on the cabin, though, that alone could have taken weeks. He patched the porch with salvaged planks from the lumberyard's discard pile, repainted the door with leftover paint he asked for quietly at the hardware store, and replaced the broken window pane with a piece of glass that didn't quite fit, but held the wind out well enough. The graveyard behind the house never seemed to bother him. If anything, it gave him comfort, the quiet, the stillness, the sense that no one there would ask questions. On most days he could be seen trimming the grass around the graves, gently pulling weeds from between the headstones, never speaking, just moving with purpose. He didn't touch the stones themselves, not unless they'd fallen over, and when he did, he lifted them like they were bones with care, with reverence. Around the church he offered his labor without words. He fixed the bent gutter that had been leaking for 3 winters. He replaced the warped boards on the ramp where Mrs. Mayfield's wheelchair always got stuck. He planted marigolds around the church sign without anyone asking, and watered them every morning before the sun got high. People started noticing. They didn't say much, just watched. Some nodded when they passed. Others whispered that maybe he used to be a carpenter, or maybe a vet, or maybe just someone running from something so big, so unspeakable, he had to bury it in sweat and soil. He never corrected them, never said a word about who he used to be or why his hands trembled slightly when he stopped working. For him, labor was silence, and silence was safety. The town slowly grew used to him, their quiet caretaker, who didn't speak, but always showed up. No one knew where he went at night, what he prayed for when he stood behind the chapel with eyes closed tight. But they knew that every morning something small was better than it had been the day before. A nail replaced, a step mended, a flower blooming where yesterday was bare. And the man they called Mr. Witt, who once bought silence with money, now traded it for presence, one quiet act at a time. She saw him before anyone else did really saw him. Not the man with white hair and sun-leathered skin that others passed on the sidewalk. Not the quiet drifter fixing broken fence posts and church steps, but him. The man who had once stood before her with a silver pen and trembling hands asking her to sign a paper that would make everything disappear. Clara was walking back from the market, her basket half full and her mind already halfway home, when she spotted the figure across the street crouched beside the chapel steps with a wrench in one hand and rusted bolts in the other. The light hit his face at an angle she hadn't seen in 17 years, but her body remembered before her mind caught up an involuntary jolt through her chest, a tightening in the throat. The sharp and unmistakable sensation of memory blooming like a bruise. He looked thinner now, softer, maybe like life had taken more than it gave and left him somewhere between fading and forgotten. But the way his eyes narrowed in concentration, the way his shoulders curled in as if protecting something unspeakable that was him. Henry Whitmore. He didn't look up. He didn't see her. And yet Clara stood frozen on the sidewalk, the world around her dimming into a hush as everything she'd buried clawed its way back to the surface. Her fingers gripped the basket until the tomatoes bruised beneath her thumbs. He moved differently now, slower, but with intention, like a man measuring every breath, every step, as though afraid of misusing the second chance time had mistakenly handed him. She hadn't spoken his name in nearly 2 decades. Not aloud. Not even in private. After what he did, she'd locked that part of herself away, shoved it behind the long nights rocking a baby with fevered lungs, behind the jobs taken under fake names, behind the letters she wrote and never sent. And now, here he was, not in a headline, not behind some high-rise glass office in New York or on a yacht with a younger woman, but kneeling in Kentucky dirt, tending to weeds and rust like they were sacred. Clara didn't believe in signs. She didn't believe in destiny. But something about the way the breeze shifted just then, how the church bell rang, even though it wasn't Sunday, made her feel as if the universe had finally circled back for its reckoning. She didn't speak. She didn't call out. She turned, slowly walked the long way home and sat on her porch, with shaking knees and a heart she no longer trusted. That night she watched him from behind the curtain as he lit a lamp in the little cabin by the cemetery. He moved like someone carrying invisible weight, like every motion cost him a piece of his soul, and yet she saw no guilt on his face, only weariness. Only the long, hollow ache of a man who came back not to be forgiven, but to endure. And Clara knew without a doubt that she was the only one in town who remembered who he really was. The only one who had the right to look him in the eye and ask why now. But she didn't. Not yet. Because some questions deserved to sit in silence first. Some truths needed to ache a while before they were spoken. Ellie wasn't like the other girls in Wilburn. She didn't talk much, some said not at all, but it wasn't that she couldn't speak. It was that she didn't see the point in words that didn't carry weight. She spent most of her afternoons sitting barefoot on the porch, a weathered sketchbook in her lap, pencil moving in slow, deliberate circles as she traced things. Only she seemed to notice the crooked angle of a church bell, the shadow of a rusted fence post at dusk, the way a bird hesitated before landing. People called her strange, but Clara knew better. Ellie wasn't broken. She was tuned to a frequency most had forgotten how to hear. And it was Ellie who first started watching the man they called Mr. Wit. Not with suspicion or judgment, but with the quiet, intense curiosity of someone recognizing a familiar shape in a mirror she hadn't meant to glance at. At first, she simply noticed his routine, how he showed up each morning with the same quiet rhythm, sweeping the church steps, clearing leaves from the cemetery path, never speaking unless spoken to. He never looked around, never waved, never smiled. And yet Ellie saw something in him that made her pause in mid-sketch and tilt her head, as if she were studying the lines of his posture, the heavy way he carried himself, the invisible weight that bent his back more than time ever could. She started sketching him before she even realized what she was doing. In one drawing, he was hunched over a flower-bed, hands in the dirt. In another, he stood by the chapel gate, barely visible through the trees. She didn't show them to anyone, not even her mother. Clara would have asked too many questions, would have read too much into it. But Ellie wasn't drawing a stranger. She was drawing a question she didn't yet know how to ask. At night, she'd lie on the roof outside her window, eyes fixed on the stars, fingers smudged with charcoal. Sometimes she'd wonder why she felt drawn to this man. Not safe exactly, but known. As if part of her recognized something long buried, some old echo in his silence that hummed in harmony with her own. One morning she saw him pause while fixing the church sign, just a small hesitation, hand gripping the frame. Breath shallow like pain had caught him off guard. He didn't cry out. He didn't rest. He just pressed his palm against the wood and closed his eyes. That's when Ellie began drawing his hands. Again and again. Cracked, calloused, holding things, letting things go. She filled 2 pages with sketches of his hands before realizing she had never looked that closely at anyone else's before. He didn't notice her watching, not really. But once as he passed the fence line by her porch, she caught his eye through the open window. He nodded slightly just once, and she didn't nod back. Instead, she drew a small figure kneeling beside a flower, and in the corner of the page, for the first time in weeks, she wrote 3 words beneath it. He stays now. It wasn't much, but for Ellie, who spoke in images and listened with her whole body, it meant everything. Something was shifting, something she couldn't name yet, and deep down, she knew she'd seen that man in a dream long before he ever stepped onto Wilburn soil. Clara didn't mean to write the letter that night. She hadn't planned it, hadn't even looked at a pen in weeks except to sign delivery slips or jot down the grocery list that always ended with milk, apples, coffee. But something about seeing him there again, alive, breathing, standing in the same town she had clawed her way through for 17 years, had cracked open a door inside her that she thought she'd sealed shut. She lit a single lamp, sat at the small oak desk she'd inherited from her mother, and pulled out a yellowed piece of stationery she had saved for no reason other than the weight of it felt honest. The first sentence came out trembling, unsure of itself, but once it landed, the rest followed like a flood breaching a dam. To the Wilburn Town Council, she began, her hand tightening as memory clawed its way back into her bloodstream. I never thought I'd write this, and I don't expect anything from it, but silence has rotted in my chest long enough. She wrote slowly at first, shaping each letter with the kind of precision you use when carving something into stone, because that's what this was, an etching of pain into permanence. She told them about Henry Whitmore. Not Mr. Whit, not the man they'd seen trimming hedges and fixing gutters with quiet dignity, but the Henry who had stood in a penthouse apartment 17 years ago and pulled out a checkbook instead of a spine. She recounted the moment he found out she was pregnant, the way he stared at her stomach like it was a curse, the way his hands shook as he said, "We can't let this destroy everything. Destroy." That was the word he used. As if the life growing inside her was a virus meant to unravel his empire. She told them how he offered her money more than she'd ever seen, more than she could imagine then. Enough to take care of it, to go away quietly, to ensure his spotless name remained untouched. She told them how he never said the word baby, not once. Only problem. Only fix it. And how, when she refused, when she said no, his eyes turned cold, not angry, just distant like a door closing. He handed her the envelope anyway. Said she'd change her mind. Said she had until Friday. Then he walked out and she never saw him again. Until now. Until Wilburn. Until the man who paid to erase her child started mowing the grass around the very graves she used to weep beside when Ellie was still sick and too small to breathe on her own. Clara didn't ask the council for justice. She didn't ask them to do anything at all. But she needed the truth to exist somewhere outside of her own bones. She needed it written down, real impossible to bury again. By the time she finished, the ink had run in places from the tremor in her hand. She folded the pages, gently placed them in an envelope without a return address, and sealed it with a piece of tape instead of a lick, her mouth too dry from what she'd swallowed all these years. She sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the envelope like it might explode. Then she turned off the lamp, placed the letter in the drawer, and told herself she'd throw it away tomorrow. But even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't. Some truths rot in silence, but others burn too loud to ignore. She hadn't meant to keep the baby, not at first. Not when her hands were still shaking from the weight of his words, not when the envelope full of hush money sat heavy in her purse like it could smother a soul. But Clara had never been the kind of woman who could follow through with a lie just because it came wrapped in comfort. The moment she heard the heartbeat, that tiny fluttering rhythm echoing through the cold sonogram room, something inside her shifted, something deep and ancient and unyielding. She walked out of that clinic without looking back, without touching the envelope again. She left the city the next morning. No phone calls, no goodbyes, just a suitcase, a battered sedan, and a child not yet born but already loud in her blood. The first place she stopped was too expensive. The second smelled like mildew. The third, Wilburn, felt like forgetting. A small town with one diner, one church, and 100 stories buried under polite smiles. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions, where you could rent a room and give only your first name, and no one would press for more. Clara found a job bussing tables at the diner, her belly growing under borrowed uniforms. She didn't speak of the father. When asked, she said nothing at all, and eventually people stopped asking. Silence became her armor. She found an old house on Hickory Road left vacant after the last tenant passed away, and she paid what little she had to take over the lease. The roof leaked, the pipes groaned, and the heater worked only when kicked twice and prayed over. But it had walls, a door that locked, and windows that faced the sunrise. It was enough. When the baby came, it was a stormy night in late March, and Clara gave birth alone, wrapped in blankets on the kitchen floor, her teeth clenched around a dish rag to keep from waking the neighbors. She named the baby Ellie, not short for anything, just Ellie, because it sounded like something soft that could survive hard places. The first year was the hardest. Ellie was small, sick often, with lungs that seemed too fragile for this world. Clara stayed up night after night with a hand on the baby's chest, counting the seconds between breaths, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She worked long hours when she could, took sewing jobs at night, walked miles to find discount medicine and second-hand clothes. There were moments she almost gave up, when the bills outweighed the hope, when the silence in her house felt like a coffin. But every time Ellie opened her eyes wide and wondering, Clara remembered why she had chosen this path. Over the years, she built a life out of scraps. She grew a garden from old seed packets, She painted the kitchen walls with colors she mixed herself. She taught Ellie to read before she could speak full sentences, taught her to draw what she couldn't say, to feel the world through charcoal and paper. And though they never had much, they had each other. For 17 years, Clara lived in the shadows, not from shame, but from necessity. She wasn't hiding from what she'd done. She was protecting what she had saved. And in every quiet morning, in every silent drawing Ellie brought to the table, Clara knew she had made the only choice that ever made sense: to stay, to fight, to love a child no one else wanted, not even the man who had helped create her. The letter sat on the desk for 3 days, folded once, sealed in a plain white envelope, no name written on the front. Clara couldn't bring herself to address it. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right morning, when the sun rose just so, and her hands didn't shake from the memories trapped in the ink. But the truth was simpler and heavier. She was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to let those words exist outside of her body. Afraid of what they might change, afraid they might change nothing at all. She passed by the envelope every morning as she poured her coffee, her eyes flitting toward it like it was a loaded weapon waiting to go off. She kept hearing his voice echoing from a lifetime ago, calm, calculated, cold. "We can't let this destroy everything." It wasn't a memory she wanted, and certainly not one she ever asked for. But there it was, louder now, as if the letter had summoned it back into her bloodstream. On the 4th night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the envelope between her fingers. The house was quiet except for the sound of Ellie turning pages in the other room, her sketchbook brushing against the quilt. Clara studied the edges of the envelope as if the truth inside might bleed through. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years, not in front of anyone, but her jaw locked tight as she reached for the drawer beneath the sink and pulled out a matchbook. She walked out to the back porch where the wind was still and the sky hung low with stars, and she stared down at the letter like it might beg for its life. It didn't. There were no ghosts, no voices, no cinematic unraveling of emotion. Just her, the dark, and a truth she no longer wanted to hold. She lit the match, watched the flame tremble against the breeze, then touched it to the edge of the envelope. The fire caught quickly. She dropped it into an old ceramic bowl and stood there as the paper curled in on itself, the ink blackening into smoke, the confession collapsing into ash. It smelled like cedar and carbon and something else she couldn't name, something final. The letter didn't scream. It didn't resist. It simply vanished as if it had never existed at all. Clara watched until the last corner burned, until there was nothing left but the blackened ring of silence in a bowl too small to hold the weight of what had once been inside. She thought she'd feel relief, maybe even release, but all she felt was empty. Lighter, yes, but not in the way one hopes. More like a room stripped bare after everything has been packed up and hauled away, still standing but echoing now. She left the bowl on the porch and went back inside. Didn't say a word. Ellie didn't ask. That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, telling herself it had been the right decision, that the past was better buried, that no one needed to know what kind of man Henry Whitmore had once been. But deep down, even as sleep finally crept in like a thief, she knew just because something burns doesn't mean it disappears. Some truths turn to ash, but they linger in the air long after the fire is gone. What Clara didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed, even in her most anxious midnight hours, was that the letter hadn't truly died in the flames that danced in her ceramic bowl. The words, blackened and curling, had turned to ash beneath her gaze, but a copy still lived quietly, patiently waiting to rise. Months earlier, when Clara had first begun to write the letter in her head, long before she dared put pen to paper, she'd mentioned it in passing to her neighbor, Judith Hale. Judith, an older woman with cloud-white hair and a voice like dry corn husks, had once taught typing at the community college before arthritis took her hands. They shared a back fence and the occasional pound cake, and though Clara never spoke much of her past, she'd once confessed while watering the garden, face turned away, that there were things she might one day need to put in writing. Judith had nodded slowly, understanding in the way only old women do, and told her if she ever needed help, she still kept her typewriter in the den. Clara had never intended to take her up on the offer, but one night, after too many bad dreams and one long, shaking stare at Henry's silhouette across the road, she showed up at Judith's door with a handwritten draft asking for help, turning her storm of ink into something clean and legible. Judith didn't ask questions. She simply pushed aside the crossword puzzle, pulled out her old Olympia typewriter, and began transcribing. The clacking of the keys echoed through the quiet little house like hammers on glass. When it was done, Judith handed her the neat copy, 3 crisp pages. The margins aligned the lines straight as fence posts. "Proofread it," she said softly. "Then burn it if you must." Clara did. She took the pages home, folded them carefully, sealed them in an envelope, and stared at them for days. And when the guilt and fear wrapped too tight around her chest, she did exactly what she told herself: she would set them alight and watch the fire eat her confession whole. What she didn't know was that Judith had made a second copy, not out of betrayal but instinct. Something in Clara's hands, how they trembled, how they clutched the letter like it might either save or drown her, told Judith that this story was bigger than one person's regret. So she slid the carbon copy into an old manila folder labeled only Wilburn Confidential and tucked it away until the time felt right. Weeks later, after Henry's name began to slip through hushed conversations at the church potluck, after someone at the hardware store muttered, "He don't move like a stranger," and Clara started walking a little faster past the chapel steps, Judith knew what she had to do. She took the folder, sealed it, and mailed it anonymously to the editor of the local paper. She didn't sign her name. She didn't leave a return address. She simply let the truth go like a seed on the wind, trusting that whatever happened next, it was time. And when the article ran 2 weeks later, front page bold headline, "Who is Mr. Witt?" Clara stood frozen in her kitchen with the newspaper trembling in her hands, her mouth dry, her breath caught somewhere between panic and prophecy. She had burned her past, but someone else had saved it, and now the town would know everything. The article appeared on a Thursday, printed in thick black ink across the front page of the Wilburn Sentinel, a paper that usually reserved its headlines for church bake sales and tractor fairs. But that morning, stacked in neat bundles outside the gas station and folded on the counter at the diner, the headline screamed louder than any siren the town had ever known: "Who is Mr. Witt, the billionaire in our backyard?" There was no byline, no journalist claiming credit. Just the sharp surgical prose of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had facts, names, dates, and the unmistakable scent of long-held silence being snapped open. In 3 columns of tightly packed type, the article laid it all bare. Mr. Witt, the quiet man who had arrived in Wilburn under a cloud of anonymity, who trimmed hedges at the chapel and patched broken porch steps without asking for a dime, was not a carpenter, not a handyman, not some war-weathered veteran finding peace in a quiet town. He was Henry Whitmore, former CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a global finance juggernaut once valued at over $9 billion before his sudden and mysterious resignation 17 years ago. The story detailed his meteoric rise in the corporate world, the way he had charmed boardrooms and manipulated markets with equal finesse. Then it took a darker turn, hinting at a personal scandal that had never quite surfaced in national headlines: a woman and a pregnancy buried beneath non-disclosure agreements and carefully timed donations to silence gossip. There was no explicit accusation, but the implication pulsed between every line. The man who now planted marigolds outside the town church had once signed checks to make people disappear. The article questioned why he had chosen Wilburn. Why this town? Why now? It cited land purchase records under a shell. LC pointed to odd cash payments, quoted an anonymous source who had helped prepare a letter regarding a child and a payoff. Though names were carefully omitted, the breadcrumbs were clear. Anyone who had lived in Wilburn long enough, and Wilburn was the kind of place where people didn't move in so much as grow roots, could follow them straight to Clara. At the post office, people read it twice. At the hair salon, they whispered as if the news itself might overhear them. By noon, the church ladies had stopped their hymns mid-rehearsal, passing the article from hand to trembling hand. No one had seen this coming. No one had guessed that the man with the quiet eyes and calloused palms had once stood at the top of an empire. But what shocked them more wasn't the wealth or the lie, it was the reason. People began to re-watch every quiet kindness, every nod, every silence, and ask themselves, was he repenting or hiding? The children stopped waving at him as he passed. The gas station clerk fumbled his change. Even the pastor paused when Mr. Witt approached with a new bag of mulch. That day, the town of Wilburn didn't just learn a name. They learned a story unfinished, fractured, and far more complicated than they'd imagined. And while Mr. Witt might have walked into town unnoticed, he would never walk through it invisible again. By the time the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street, the town was already alive with the buzz of rumor, speculation, and something sharper, betrayal. The article had traveled faster than wildfire, passed from porch to porch, gas station to barber shop, with the kind of urgency reserved for scandal, not salvation. People read it with furrowed brows and parted lips, their hands tightening around coffee mugs or folding chairs or steering wheels as if the words might slip out and burn them. Mr. Witt, the man who had become a quiet fixture in their lives, the one who fixed broken steps without being asked, who raked the churchyard leaves while the rest of them were still waking up, was not some gentle drifter down on his luck. He was a former billionaire, a man who had vanished from the world stage at the height of his power, and according to the whispers now catching wind through every alley and kitchen, he had done so to escape something far worse than a corporate scandal. Some townspeople were furious, not because of who he had once been, but because of what he had hidden. "We let him near our children," one mother hissed to another at the playground. "He's been watching the school crosswalk, helping at the library. Who knows what else?" The fire chief called him a liar, straight to the sheriff's face, fists clenched as if the deception had been personal. The manager of the general store, who had once set aside bruised peaches for him at a discount, now refused to make eye contact when he came in for bread and soap. There was a shift in the way people walked past him on the street, more space left between their bodies, more silence loaded with suspicion. But not everyone believed the worst. Some remembered the hours he spent repairing things no one else would touch, the way he showed up after storms to clear branches from the roads, the way he never once asked for thanks. "People change," Old Man Donnelly said over a beer at the tavern. "Hell, maybe he's trying to do right now." But even those who defended him lowered their voices as if afraid the act of kindness might mark them. The article hadn't just named a man, it had drawn a line through the town, dividing the comfortable illusion of who they thought he was from the uncomfortable possibility of what he might have done, and no one liked having to choose between the two. At the diner where he usually sat in the corner booth with black coffee and a paperback, the waitress skipped his table entirely. Outside the post office, two teenagers rode their bikes past him, one of them shouting, "Hey, billionaire, forgot your crown," before speeding off into nervous laughter. Even the pastor, who had once praised his quiet service, now looked at him with the same expression he reserved for funeral homes, solemn, distant grieving, something invisible. In a town as small as Wilburn, secrets didn't just surface, they shattered. And though Henry hadn't spoken a single word in his own defense, the silence he wore so carefully now clung to him like guilt. They didn't know the full story, not yet, but that didn't stop them from deciding what parts to believe. And as the day turned into night and the headlines folded into gossip, one thing was clear. Wilburn was no longer a place he could simply disappear into. It was the old pastor, Reverend Amos Whitaker, who finally broke the silence in a way that mattered. While the rest of Wilburn tore itself in two, with whispers, suspicions, and sideways glances, it was Amos, now nearing 80 and half blind in one eye, who stood up during Sunday service and said the words no one else had dared to speak aloud. "I knew him, years ago, before any of you did." The congregation went still. It was the kind of stillness that pressed against the walls, not reverent, not spiritual, something tighter, thinner, like glass about to crack. Amos didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His voice was the kind that had once filled tents during revivals, the kind that could part noise like a curtain, even in its weary age. I saw him speak at a financial summit in Atlanta 17, maybe 18 years back. He was the keynote. Sharp suit, polished words, charisma you could bottle and sell to the desperate. The kind of man who made you sit up straight whether you liked him or not. A few people gasped quietly as if hearing a ghost's name spoken aloud. The name Henry Whitmore still hung unspoken in the chapel air, even though the newspapers had shouted it 2 days before. Amos rested his hand on the pulpit and looked down at the front pew where Mrs. Langley clutched her prayer book like a shield. Back then, he continued, I didn't know his heart, just his face, and I remember thinking, here's a man who's going to own the world one day. You could feel it in the room. Every banker, every donor, every lobbyist leaned forward when he spoke. His voice grew quieter, more tired. But the man who came to Wilburn, that wasn't the same man. A murmur passed through the pews, uncertain flickering like candlelight in a draught. He came here not as a king, not as a captain of industry, Amos said, but as a man looking to do something with his hands again. Something real. He never asked for your money, never asked for your vote. He swept these very floors. He fixed the leak in that roof. He pointed upward the stained glass trembling in the sunlight. He sat in the back pew and listened when no one else was here. Sometimes I'd find him praying alone. No words, just tears. And whether he's Henry Whitmore or Mr. Whit or nobody at all, what I saw in him these past months was not a fraud. Some looked down ashamed. Others kept their arms crossed, unmoved. But everyone listened. I don't know what sins he carries. I don't know what he ran from. But I do know this people don't come to a place like Wilburn to be seen. They come to be forgiven. He paused, letting that settle. And maybe God sent him here to learn what it means to stay. When the service ended, no one rushed out. They lingered, unsure now of where judgment ended and mercy began. Outside, the sky was overcast, the light muted. But in the small chapel where Henry had once mended the windows in silence, something shifted, not an absolution, not yet, but a crack in the armor of public outrage. Reverend Amos had spoken not as a friend or a defender, but as a witness. And in a town like Wilburn, where memory is currency and character is judged in silence, that kind of witness still held weight. It was evening when she asked, the kind of quiet golden evening where the world feels suspended in amber, where the wind slows and the sky forgets its rush to dark. Clara was in the kitchen, hands deep in soapy dishwater, her mind drifting somewhere far from the scent of leftover potatoes and the creak of their old screen door. Ellie sat at the table, sketchbook, open pencil, unmoving for once. She had been unusually still all day, less interested in drawing more, focused on something internal, something fragile and forming. Clara didn't notice at first. She thought Ellie was simply tired or perhaps disappointed that the diner had run out of the pie she liked. But then in a voice so soft it nearly disappeared into the clink of rinsed dishes, Ellie asked, "Is he my dad?" The sound was small, but it hit Clara like a dropped glass, sharp and immediate. Her hands froze in the water. The air shifted. The only sound for a long moment was the faucet's quiet hiss. Ellie didn't repeat herself. She didn't have to. The words hung there between them, heavy and shivering. Clara turned slowly, drying her hands on a towel that suddenly felt too thin, too small to hold the weight of 17 years of silence. Ellie wasn't looking at her. Her eyes were on the table, on a sketch she had done earlier that day. Just a man's hands, palms open, scars traced in pencil like old roads. "What did you say?" Clara asked, even though she had heard it perfectly. Ellie looked up now. Her eyes were calm, not accusatory, just full of something deeper, knowing. "Mr. Whit, is he—" "My father." Clara's breath caught. It was the question she had feared would come, and yet one she'd rehearsed answers for in 100 sleepless nights. But now face to face with it, with her daughter, this half-silent, luminous soul who had never once asked why their family looked different, why other kids had baby pictures of smiling men holding them in hospital rooms. Clara realized there was no perfect answer, only the truth. "Yes," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "His real name is Henry Whitmore, and yes, he's your father." Ellie didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or cry. She simply nodded once slowly, as if confirming something she had already begun to suspect. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, not out of blame, but out of something more heartbreaking longing. Clara stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "Because I was afraid," she said honestly. "Afraid you'd hate him. Afraid you'd love him. Afraid I wouldn't know how to protect you from either." Ellie blinked, tears brimming but not falling. "Did he know about me?" Clara hesitated. "He knew that I was pregnant, and he didn't want you. He tried to make me." Her voice broke and she couldn't finish, but Ellie, in her quiet brilliance, understood anyway. She reached for her mother's hand and held it, not out of comfort but solidarity. A pact forged not in forgiveness, not yet, but in clarity. For the first time in her life, Ellie knew where she came from, and it didn't change the shape of her heart, it just gave it edges. She looked out the window toward the small house by the cemetery where the light was still on. "I think he wants to try again," she said softly. And Clara, stunned by the courage in her daughter's voice, could only nod through the ache. The forbidden word had been spoken. Father. And now that it was out, it could never be unsaid. Henry felt the stares before he saw them. They clung to his back like shadows, lingered in doorways, peeked through curtains, whispered behind coffee mugs at the diner. The air in Wilburn had changed, thicker now, charged with suspicion, curiosity, and that small-town hunger for truth wrapped in scandal. People paused when he walked past. Conversations that had once included him fell suddenly quiet. Eyes followed him to the hardware store, to the chapel steps, to the cemetery gate. Yet he said nothing. He offered no apology, no explanation, and most notably no exit. He stayed. Each morning he still rose before dawn, still made black coffee in the dented pot, still walked the same path to the churchyard, toolbox in one hand, his silence in the other. He pulled weeds, painted the fence, repaired a cracked stone near the grave of a woman he'd never met. He did it with the same quiet concentration as before, as if nothing in the world had changed, even though he knew everything had. The weight of being known again, truly known, pressed against him like a second skin. He could feel the town judging him from behind glass and hedges, but he didn't flinch. He had run once 17 years ago, when the truth was too loud and the consequences too distant. He would not run now. Some mornings the pastor nodded at him from the church window. Other times the librarian left him a thermos of tea near the steps without a word. Small gestures, echoes of dignity. But most simply watched, waiting for a breakdown, a confession, a departure. None came. Henry worked. He fixed what was broken. He asked for nothing. He knew there were those who wanted him gone, who thought he had no right to stand among them after the lies, the silence, the name he'd buried. But he also knew something deeper. This was the first place he'd ever felt the shape of his own humility. The manual labor, the solitude, the eyes of a daughter who hadn't known his face until now, all of it grounded him more than billion-dollar meetings ever had. So when the whispers sharpened, he didn't raise his voice. When the glares lingered, he didn't look away. He simply stayed. One nail, one shingle, one honest breath at a time. Because after all these years, staying was the only thing he had left to give. He was planting lavender behind the church when she approached, knees in the dirt. Hands stained the scent of crushed stems rising around him like memory. He didn't hear her footsteps at first. Clara had always moved quietly, not out of fear, but out of restraint, like someone who'd taught herself not to disturb the world more than necessary. When he finally looked up, the sun was behind her, framing her in a pale gold that made her look untouchable, like a question long left unanswered. She didn't speak right away, and neither did he. The silence between them was not awkward. It was thick, lived in, full of things they'd never said and knew better than to try all at once. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands, unsure whether to greet her or brace for impact. But when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, flat even. Not cold, not angry. Just exhausted from carrying a truth no one else had ever fully acknowledged. She looked him straight in the eyes, not blinking, not trembling, and said, If I had let her die, would your life have gone better? The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. No scream, no accusation, just a ripple that would echo for miles. Henry didn't move. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He felt every beat of his heart like a drum against his ribs, like it was answering a question he hadn't earned the right to face. Ellie, she added more softly now, though her voice didn't break. 17 years of hospital bills and night shifts and coughing in the dark. If I had done what you wanted, would you be happier, richer, untouched? He didn't answer right away. What could he say to that? That he was sorry, that he hadn't meant it, that back then he was too young, too afraid, too poisoned by a life of privilege and fear and fragile ego. None of that would touch what she'd endured. None of it could undo the fact that she had made the harder choice the braver one and lived with the consequences while he disappeared into shadows and silence. So he didn't say sorry. He didn't beg. He just met her gaze and said hoarsely, "No, I wouldn't." That was it. 3 words. The only truth he had left. And Clara, hearing them, nodded once, just once, and walked away without another word. Not because it was over, but because something had finally been spoken that neither of them could ever take back. He didn't answer. Not right away. Not even when the weight of her words hung in the air like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. Clara's question settled deep in the dirt between them, more raw than cruel, more honest than anything he'd ever heard from her before. If I had let her die, would your life have gone better? It was the kind of sentence that didn't just demand an answer. It split time into before and after. And still, Henry said nothing. He stood there, hands still streaked with soil, fingers twitching slightly, as if his body hadn't quite caught up with his breath. His lips parted once, maybe to speak, maybe to break, but no sound came. Only silence. And the silence was louder than any confession. His eyes found hers, then faltered. There was no anger in her face, no grief he could grab hold of and fight against. Just stillness. The terrible, dignified kind. It made it harder. He wished she had screamed at him, pushed him, demanded something cruel so he could react, so he could justify his own failure in the noise of it. But Clara had come with no drama, only truth. And now he stood inside it, hollowed. His eyes reddened. Not just from the sun or the pollen that drifted lazily through the churchyard, but from something older, something he had held back for too long. The tears didn't fall. They just sat there, threatening, swollen, shimmering in the corners like a tide he refused to release. His throat clenched. A lifetime of practice control. The boardrooms, the media training, the months of silence here in Wilburn, none of it could teach him what to do with this moment. There was no script for a man standing in the presence of a woman who had carried what he abandoned and raised it into something he would never deserve to touch. And so he said nothing. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because he didn't know how to carry the weight of her pain in words that would matter. Anything he said now would sound too little too late, and it was. The silence became his confession. The redness in his eyes became the apology he hadn't earned the right to give. Clara waited a moment longer, long enough to see if he would try. When he didn't, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and turned away. She didn't need his answer. She had never needed it. She had simply needed to ask. And Henry left, standing alone behind the church with trembling hands and tearless eyes, understood that this silence, this reckoning, was the beginning of something he would carry to the end of his life. It was just past sunset when Henry heard the soft knock. 3 gentle taps, uncertain, almost hesitant, barely audible over the quiet hum of cicadas outside. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came. He moved slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands on the rag he kept by the door, his back aching from hours spent kneeling in the garden. When he opened it, Ellie stood there, small and still, holding something wrapped in brown paper. She didn't say a word. Her expression was unreadable calm, but unreadable like always a mask of quiet that revealed just enough to keep him off balance. She stepped inside when he moved out of the way, her bare feet making no sound on the old wooden floor. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't dare. He simply followed her to the small table near the window where the light was dim and golden from the single lamp he kept on during the evenings. Without a word, Ellie placed the package on the table, unwrapped it slowly, and turned it toward him. It was a drawing her drawing, and he recognized the strokes immediately, delicate, precise, full of silence and meaning. Charcoal and soft pastel blended into a gentle scene rendered with care. In the center was a man, older, bent at the knees, planting a tree. His hands were in the soil, his head bowed, not in shame but in quiet effort. The man was unmistakably Henry. His posture, his work boots, even the faint outline of the scar on his right arm, that only someone watching closely would know to include. But it wasn't the man that caught his breath. It was the two small figures standing in the background, distant, but clearly watching. A girl and a boy, young, maybe 6 or 7, their hands just barely touching their bodies, leaning slightly toward one another, as if caught in the act of choosing to stay or run. Their faces were blurred, impressionistic, but he could feel the weight of their gaze. They weren't approaching, but they weren't leaving either. They were simply there, present, watching this man plant something into the earth with aching hands and no guarantee it would grow. Henry stared at the drawing for a long time. Ellie stood across from him, saying nothing. Her arms hung loose at her sides. No expectation, no demand. Just presence. He looked at the image again, his fingers hovering over the edges of the paper, like it might disappear if he touched it too harshly. The message was clear, not in words, but in lines in space. She sees me, not as the man he was, not as the one who ran, but as the man trying quietly, messily late. He looked up, eyes red again, throat tight, with something deeper than guilt, something closer to grace. Ellie didn't wait for thanks. She turned and walked to the door as silently as she had come. But before stepping out, she paused just for a moment and looked back. Not with a smile, but with something softer recognition. Then she was gone, and Henry was left alone, staring at a drawing that said everything she didn't have to. The notice went up on Monday morning, typed in all caps, posted on the corkboard outside Town Hall, the diner window, and taped crookedly to the door of the church. Community meeting. Public inquiry regarding Mr. Whit Henry Whitmore. Thursday, 6 p.m. Town Hall. No one needed to ask what it was about. The newspaper article had cracked the town wide open, and now the officials, mostly volunteers in pressed flannel and weathered boots, had to respond to the tension pulsing through every corner of Wilburn like an electric wire. Some called it a hearing, others whispered it was a trial. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew this was Wilburn's way of deciding what to do with a man who had once vanished from the world stage, only to reappear planting flowers by the church fence. By Thursday, the town hall was packed. Folding chairs lined the wood-paneled room, creaking under the weight of neighbors who had rarely attended these kinds of gatherings before. Clara was there, standing at the back, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Ellie sat beside her sketchbook, unopened for once, eyes fixed ahead. The pastor sat quietly in the third row, hands folded in his lap as though preparing for a funeral. And in the front, under the faded seal of the town and the hum of old fluorescent lights, sat the 5 members of the Wilburn Community Council, 3 men, 2 women, all of whom had known Henry for less than a year, but felt the burden of judgment like it was a generational inheritance. Henry arrived just before 6. He walked in alone, his expression unreadable, and took a seat in the front row without saying a word. No lawyer, no speech. Just the same man who had scrubbed the church gutters and fixed the steps at the library, now waiting to be reviewed like a line item on a spreadsheet. The meeting opened with protocol roll call, a reading of the notice and a brief acknowledgement of the article that had raised concern. But then came the murmurs, the public comments, the wary voices rising like a storm cloud. Who is he really? What's he hiding? Did he come here to buy us out, to bury another secret? One woman, nervous kind, stood and said, "He helped my husband when the roof caved in, didn't ask for a thing." Another man shouted, "That doesn't make him innocent." The room swayed between suspicion and defense, between anger and uncertainty. Each voice added another layer to the question no one could quite name. What do we owe a man who tried to disappear? Henry remained silent. Not stoic, not smug, just quiet. Like someone who knew the sound of shame and no longer feared it. They didn't vote. Wilburn wasn't that kind of place. But when the council announced they would take the matter under advisement, everyone knew the decision wasn't really about legality. It was about belonging, and whether or not the town was willing to believe that a man who once ran from the truth could now be running toward it. The town hadn't been this divided in years, not since the drought of '97, when people argued over who was stealing from the communal well, or maybe that ugly school board fight over the biology textbook. But this was different. This wasn't about water or curriculum or the usual small-town friction that flares and fades with the seasons. This was about a man, one man. A stranger turned, neighbor turned revelation. And now, with the article in everyone's hands and the community meeting still fresh in their minds, Wilburn became a battlefield of hushed accusations and impassioned defenses that spilled from church steps to barbershops, grocery aisles to front porches. On one side were those who felt betrayed deeply and personally. "He lied to us," growled Earl Simmons outside the general store, slamming his sack of feed onto the truck bed. "Came in here with a fake name, pretending to be someone he wasn't. We let him into our homes, let him play saint with his shovel and his silence." Others nodded along their agreement, simmering. They felt manipulated, duped into trusting a man who had once walked Wall Street in $1,000 shoes while they saved for winter tires. "He's dangerous," someone whispered during choir practice. "If he hid this for so long, what else is he hiding?" Fear began to seed itself in the edges of these conversations. Not fear of violence, but fear of the unknown, the uncontrollable. To them, Henry represented every outsider who had ever come in with soft hands and hidden motives. But not everyone saw it that way. "He hasn't done anything wrong since he got here," said Miriam Lane, a retired nurse, standing her ground in front of the post office as two older men scoffed beside her. "He's kind, quiet, works harder than most folks half his age. You think planting flowers by the cemetery is some kind of master plan for revenge. He paid for the new windows at the library, added a teacher. Out of pocket. Anonymous donation. I found out through the supplier. He's changed," whispered the pastor's wife, clutching her Bible with both hands, though whether she was trying to prove it to the others or herself no one could tell. The arguments intensified day by day. The town split not just by belief, but by tone, one side sharp and loud, the other soft and firm. Families even fought within themselves. Clara didn't speak out publicly, but those who knew her could see it in her posture, in the way she stood when people talked about that man within earshot, like she was holding up a wall others couldn't see. Ellie, too, had begun sitting on the church steps in the evenings, sketching in full view, making it quietly known where she stood. And yet for all the noise, Henry said nothing. He neither defended nor denied. He simply continued showing up, mowing the lawn behind the schoolhouse, fixing the squeaky gate outside town hall, nodding politely at people who refused to nod back. In his silence, the town saw a mirror. Some saw guilt, others saw grief, and a few saw the beginning of something redemptive. But no one could ignore him anymore. Wilburn had become a town with a question at its center. Could a man's past condemn him forever, or could his presence, quiet and unwavering, be enough to earn the right to stay? For nearly the entire meeting, Henry sat in silence. He didn't fidget or shift in his seat. He didn't raise his hand or interrupt when people questioned his motives or speculated about his past. He didn't flinch when someone used the word coward, nor did he respond when others defended him with words like changed, humbled, or atoning. He simply sat back, straight eyes steady, like a man willing to carry every word without deflecting a single one. The council had nearly finished their closing remarks, prepared to adjourn the tense and restless gathering without resolution, when a soft voice from the back rose above the murmurs like a thread of lightning through smoke. Clara. She walked slowly down the center aisle, every step sending a ripple through the room. People leaned forward. A few gasped. Most fell completely silent, because if anyone had the right to speak that night, it was her. She didn't look at Henry when she took her place near the front, just to the side of the dais. She faced the council, and the crowd, her expression calm but unyielding, her voice low and clear, like someone who had waited 17 years to say only what mattered. "If he came here for forgiveness," she began, "I don't know if I can give it." A hush spread wider now. Even Henry tilted his head slightly, as if these were words he hadn't dared hope for. Clara continued, her eyes scanning the room, pausing briefly on faces that had whispered her name all week. I'm not sure forgiveness is something you can just hand over like a folded letter and expect the weight to lift. Some things don't lift. Some things stay with you. She breathed once, slow and full, then added, but if he came to stay, to stop running, to show up, and keep showing up not as a savior, not as someone who wants to rewrite the past, but just as a man trying to do right this time. She paused, her eyes finally meeting his, and for a moment the room shrank to just the two of them. Then I won't stop my daughter from calling him whatever she chooses. A beat of stunned silence. Then whispers again, low and looping like wind through grass. No one expected Clara to speak, and certainly not with such still, deliberate mercy. She hadn't said she forgave him. She hadn't given him redemption. But she had done something far more powerful. She had opened a door. Henry didn't speak. His eyes shimmered not with tears exactly, but with something deeper, a breaking and a rebuilding all at once. The pastor closed his notes. One council member shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to follow a truth that needed no response. That night, as the meeting dispersed and people spilled out onto the sidewalk beneath the dim glow of the town's only street lamp, no one declared victory. But something had changed. Clara had not exonerated him. She had not erased the past. She had simply chosen to stop guarding the future. And in doing so, she gave Henry the only thing he hadn't dared ask, for the chance to earn a name, not as a memory, but as a presence. The room went quiet, in the way a field goes still after a storm when the wind has stopped, but the air still remembers. Clara's words hung in the rafters of the old town hall, like smoke, not heavy, but lingering, delicate, and impossible to brush away. No one spoke. Not the council, not the pastor, not the people who had shouted and doubted and defended. They just sat breathing in the weight of what had just been said. It wasn't an endorsement. It wasn't absolution. But it was something deeper, permission maybe, or surrender. The kind of statement that doesn't close a door but leaves it cracked open just wide enough for hope to lean in. Henry didn't look around the room. He didn't meet eyes or search for approval. He just stood slowly, as if his body had become heavier from everything that had passed between him and Clara in that moment. His shoulders sagged, not from shame exactly, but from the honest burden of being seen. Really seen. For who he was, for who he wasn't, for who he might still become. He didn't speak. No justification, no apology, no explanation. He simply gathered the small notepad he had brought but never written in, nodded once barely visible, and walked down the aisle with the same quiet steps he had entered with. People shifted in their chairs as he passed, some leaning back, unsure whether to greet him or avoid him. Others lowered their eyes, unable to hold the tension between judgment and sympathy. One woman reached for her husband's hand. A teenager near the wall whispered something to his friend, but the words dissolved into the hush before they could travel. Even the council remained frozen, as if unsure whether to call after him or let him go. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots. The door groaned as he opened it. Outside, the evening air had cooled, and the faint scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the edge of town. Henry stepped into the fading light without once looking back. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just quiet, like everything he had done since arriving in Wilburn. Behind him, the room slowly exhaled. A chair scraped. A cough broke the silence. But no one quite knew what to say. Because what could you say to a man who didn't ask for redemption, who offered no defense, who simply accepted the weight of his choices and left with the dignity of silence? Henry didn't need the town's approval. And maybe in that moment, the town understood that the most powerful confession isn't shouted, it's lived. And Henry Whitmore was going to live it one quiet day at a time. It began with a letter. A simple cream-colored envelope slid beneath the heavy doors of Wilburn's modest town hall one quiet Tuesday morning. No return address, no postage stamp. Just a typewritten label that read, "To the people of Wilburn." Inside there was no fanfare, only a short note neatly typed and a cashier's check so large that the secretary Doris had to read it 3 times before she believed her eyes. The note read, "This donation is offered with quiet intention and deep respect. Use it to restore what matters. The fund shall be known as the Ellie Clara Fund. No contact necessary, no recognition desired." That was it. No name, no signature, only the name of the fund typed clearly in bold at the bottom, Ellie Clara Fund. Word spread quickly, as things always did in Wilburn. At first, people assumed it was a prank, a clerical error, some kind of mistake that would be corrected by a bank call or an apologetic stranger showing up in town. But the money cleared within days. Real, undeniable, life-changing. The number 7 figures was more than Wilburn had ever received from any donor in its long, quiet history. There was enough for the school to replace its crumbling roof, for the library to digitize its archives, for the medical clinic to finally buy the new diagnostic equipment it had been fundraising toward for over a decade. But it was the name that caught people off guard. Ellie Clara. 2 names they all knew, spoken now together as one. And though no one said it outright, everyone felt the gravity of what it implied. Ellie, quiet, brilliant, strange Ellie with her sketchbook and her silence. And Clara, fierce, steady Clara, who had raised her daughter with grace and grit, and who had stood before the town not long ago with a voice that made even the most hardened hearts pause. No one missed the echo of that meeting, the resonance of what had passed unspoken between Clara and the man they once knew as Mr. Witt. Some whispered that the fund had to be his doing. Who else would think to name it that way? Who else would give so much and ask for nothing? But there was no proof, no ceremony, no press release. The only evidence was the check, the name, and the sudden, unexpected generosity that had begun to mend things. Money rarely touched, broken trust, frayed community, weary hope. The council voted unanimously to accept the donation and honor the fund's request for discretion. There would be no plaque, no statue, only a small brass plate outside the school entrance that read, "Renovated with love from the Ellie Clara Fund." Simple, honest, quiet, just like the man who some believed had finally chosen to stop running, not with words or promises, but with action. And as the town began to repair itself, building something new from old bones, many came to believe that perhaps redemption didn't always arrive with fireworks or applause. Sometimes it came in envelopes, in silence, in the planting of trees whose shade you may never sit beneath but plant anyway. The transformation began with an empty lot, a patch of uneven ground behind the post office where weeds had ruled for years, and old bicycles lay rusting in the tall grass. No one in Wilburn had imagined it as anything more than a forgotten corner of town. But when the council announced that the first project funded by the Ellie Clara Fund would be a public library, everything shifted. It wasn't just going to be a room with books. It was going to be Wilburn's first true community library, a place where children could grow, where stories could breathe, and where those who had never been seen could finally feel visible. Construction began quietly, without ceremony. Locals showed up with toolkits and thermoses of coffee. Retired carpenters offered their hands. High schoolers volunteered on weekends, clearing brush and painting signs. There was no single architect, just a shared vision guided by a few printed floor plans and a powerful sense of purpose. By autumn, the frame had risen simple, sturdy, and open, a space filled with light and the smell of fresh lumber. Inside, shelves were installed not just for bestsellers or dusty encyclopedias, but for books that mattered to children. Picture books, stories about outsiders, tales that celebrated difference and resilience. The front room had low seating for toddlers, beanbags for readers who liked to sprawl on the floor, and a corner with an old rocking chair where Mrs. Hensley, the retired kindergarten teacher, began offering story time twice a week. But the heart of the building, the space that drew the most attention, was the classroom wing. 3 rooms each, named not after donors or politicians, but after verbs: learn, create, share. In Learn, local volunteers offered free literacy classes for adults and kids, plus weekend tutoring sessions, and even a monthly computer basics course taught by the town's only IT guy. In Create, the art room, sunlight streamed in through wide windows onto rows of easels, paintbrushes, chalk, and paper. Children gathered there after school, some for the first time, learning to express what they hadn't found words for. It was here that shy, brilliant Ellie began quietly leaving sketches in the donation box, not to sell, not to show off, just to give. Her way of signing the walls without needing her name on them. And Share became the community's gathering space, poetry nights, book clubs, even potluck discussions on what the town needed next. The Ellie Clara Library, as it came to be called, was more than a building. It was a promise. That knowledge belonged to everyone. That art was not a luxury, but a lifeline. That redemption, once whispered in church pews and doubted behind curtains, could take the shape of something you could walk into, sit down in, and hand a child a book without asking for anything in return. Wilburn had never had a space like this, but now they couldn't imagine life without it, and even those who still didn't speak Henry Whitmore's name aloud knew deep down whose hands had helped make it rise, one brick of silence, one page of grace at a time. Every afternoon, just as the sun began to tip behind the trees and the light turned soft and gold through the wide windows of the new library, Ellie would arrive. She never made a sound when she entered. No greetings, no small talk. She didn't need to. The staff knew her by now, not through words, but by the steady rhythm of her presence. She came with a worn sketchbook tucked under her arm and moved directly to the art room, where the light was brightest and the corners were lined with pastels, pencils, and wide-open tables. Sometimes she would draw for hours without pause. Other times she simply sat watching the way the shadows moved across the floor, her fingers hovering over the page but never touching down. She was never asked to explain herself, and she never offered an answer to questions that were never voiced. The space respected her quiet. She filled it with attention, not noise. Henry came later sometimes after everyone else had left, sometimes just as Ellie was settling into her usual chair. He never made a grand entrance. No clipboard, no instruction. He brought a small pail, a cloth, and a soft bristled broom, and he worked slowly, carefully, as though the building itself had to be handled like something fragile. He dusted the lower shelves first, the ones meant for small hands, and wiped the fingerprints from the front doors without complaint. Occasionally he adjusted the blinds so the light didn't fall too sharply across the reading nook, or polished the corners of the poetry section where the spines of slim books leaned gently against each other like old friends. Sometimes, when the library was especially quiet and the air had that particular stillness of early evening, he would place a new book on the shelf, usually poetry. Never anything flashy or famous, just something gentle. A voice he'd discovered in the back of a used bookstore. A volume someone had mailed anonymously, as if the library had become a living thing people wanted to feed with beauty. He never said anything about the books. He simply placed them in the same section, always on the shelf marked, "Listen," a subcategory he'd created himself. It wasn't part of the official catalog, but people noticed it eventually, and some began to leave notes inside the books. Thank yous, little sketches, favorite lines circled in pencil. Ellie never spoke to Henry directly. She didn't need to, but she watched him sometimes, just briefly, through the window of the art room as he moved down the hall with his cloth and pail, or when he leaned over to straighten a row of mismatched chairs. And every now and then, when she left for the day, she would set one of her finished sketches on the return cart by the door. No signature, just the drawing. Sometimes a girl looking at the sky, sometimes a pair of old hands planting seeds. And once quietly, she left a small illustration of a man wiping clean the glass of a library window, his reflection faintly holding the face of a younger man inside the glass. Henry found that one. He didn't frame it. He just kept it in his back pocket for weeks until the edges curled and the pencil smudged. But he never let it go. There was no ribbon cutting, no podium draped in bunting, no mayor in a borrowed suit giving a speech. When the doors of the library finally opened, there was no ceremony, just a quiet Tuesday morning and the soft creak of wood as someone pushed the door open for the first time. No brass plaque marked the name of the donor, and no one made a speech about generosity or redemption. It didn't need it. The building itself was the statement. A small wooden structure tucked gently between the diner and the old train stop, its porch lined with flower pots, and a wooden bench polished smooth by time and weather. The sign above the door didn't carry a name, it simply read, "Library." Nothing more. And that somehow was enough. Inside, the shelves were full, the chairs worn in just enough to feel welcoming. The light came in soft from the east-facing windows in the morning and settled golden across the floor by late afternoon. Children's laughter sometimes echoed through the corners, followed by the soft hush of someone reading aloud. The art room smelled faintly of paint and fresh paper, and the story corner always had an open book waiting. But what lingered most wasn't the furniture or the books. It was the stillness, a kind of peace that came not from silence, but from the sense that everything inside had been made with care and that no one who entered had to earn their place. People came and went. Some stayed to read, some left notes in the margins. Some came just to sit, to breathe, to remember what stillness felt like. And in that space, one girl with wide, watchful eyes learned to see herself not as strange or misplaced, but as someone worth being witnessed. Ellie found her corner, her rhythm, her pages. She left drawings behind like breadcrumbs for anyone willing to look closely, sketches of people planting things, reaching out, looking up. And sometimes in the late afternoon, a man with weathered hands and careful steps came by to water the flowers, wipe down the windows, or restock the poetry shelf. He didn't wear a name tag. He never introduced himself. But people began to recognize him not as the man from the article or the stranger from the past, but simply as the one who stayed. Henry didn't ask for anything. Not recognition, not praise, just the quiet permission to be present. No one spoke much about what had happened. Not anymore. It became part of the air, like the scent of old paper and wood polish, known, but no longer sharp. And in time, people stopped needing to define him by the man he used to be. They simply saw what he was now: a caretaker, a quiet fixture in the life of a little library that stood without pride, without monument, but with a kind of dignity that didn't ask to be seen, only to be felt. In the end, the library stood not as a symbol of redemption, but of something deeper: endurance. A house built not from guilt, but from the slow, hard work of staying, of showing up, of learning late, but fully what it means not to flee, but to remain. It was never about erasing the past. It was about building something true enough to stand in its shadow. And there, in that wooden house in the center of town, a child had been seen, and a father had finally learned how to stay. In the end, Henry's story isn't just about redemption. It's about the quiet, difficult courage it takes to stay. In real life, we're often taught to move on, to start over, to bury our mistakes beneath new jobs, new cities, or new names. But healing doesn't happen in escape, it happens in return. It happens in showing up again and again for the people we once hurt, even when forgiveness isn't guaranteed. Like Henry, many of us won't get the perfect apology or a grand second chance. But we can choose to stop running. We can show up with our hands open, with no expectations, and ask nothing but the chance to serve, to fix what we can, to water what we once left dry. If there's a lesson here, it's this: the past cannot be changed, but it also doesn't have to define who we are forever. The people we hurt may not welcome us with open arms, and that's their right. But our responsibility isn't to demand forgiveness. It's to become someone worth forgiving, even if no one ever says the words aloud. So if there's someone in your life you walked away from, someone you think about late at night, wondering if it's too late to return, maybe it's time. Not to explain, not to rewrite, but to show up, quietly, humbly, and stay. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave a comment. What part spoke to you the most? Don't forget to save this video so you can return to it whenever you need a quiet reminder that healing is possible. And if you want more stories like this, full of heart, humanity, and second chances, make sure to follow the channel so you never miss what comes next. We all carry scars, but sometimes it's stories like these that remind us you're not alone, and it's never too late to begin again.